Member for Peace River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Frustration and anger is building as people grapple with the impacts of this NDP government's neglect and failed forestry policies. Despite the NDP promising in 2017 that there would never be a mill shut down under their watch, mills are actually closing or being curtailed right across this province right now. I'm now being also told that BC Timber Sales has not had a sale for over 450 days and counting. More proof that this Premier has actually no intention of supporting the forestry sector or the tens of thousands of jobs in the forest that forestry families depend on here in British Columbia. So to the Premier, how many more forestry-dependent families are going to lose their jobs because of this NDP's delays and failed policies?
Minister of Jobs, Economic Development and Innovation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. And the first thing I'd like to say is that I very much am thinking about those workers who've been impacted by mill curtailment. And I'll share with the House, Mr. Speaker, that I grew up in a forestry family, and I remember what it was like in the early 80s, living in the Nanaimo when we had a mill curtailment at Harmac. It impacts individuals, it impacts families, and it impacts communities. And it's so important that we're there for workers, and we are, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of supports we put in place in a circumstance of mill curtailment, and we have workers on the ground doing that work, Mr. Speaker. It's an opportunity for us to ensure that folks land on their feet. We've got a number of programs that are immediate and some that are long-term, and both of those supports are being put in place currently, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Peace River South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. That answers cold comfort to the families that are having a hard time putting food on the table right now because of mill closures and curtailments in British Columbia. The closure of Aspen Planers in Merritt since last year has left workers without a job and a community in shock. Brian Halford, the chair of the local United Steelworkers Union, says there are permit applications sitting with this government right now for over a year that can be approved to put their workers back to work. Instead of doing his job, though, and approving permits, the Minister of Forests actually blundered in a recent interview by saying, and I quote, "In Merritt, I think the Weyerhaeuser sawmill is operating as normal," end quote. Here's the problem. There is no Weyerhaeuser mill in Merritt. In fact, it closed in the 1990s under the NDP government. So again, to the Premier, how many more forest-dependent communities and families are going to suffer before this Premier starts doing his job, approving permits and letting these mills open and get families back to work where they want to be?
Minister of Jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. We know getting workers working is the most important thing, Mr. Speaker. These workers matter to us deeply. When workers in the regions in British Columbia aren't working, British Columbia is not working, Mr. Speaker, and we know that. We have a number of programs we put in place. Let me tell you about the Manufacturing Jobs Fund, Mr. Speaker, $180 million, Mr. Speaker, to drive well-paying manufacturing jobs into the regions, Mr. Speaker. We know that we need value-added jobs, Mr. Speaker. The other side talked about it for years. We're doing that work. Let me share with the member opposite an example of what that can look like. The Premier and myself and one of our colleagues went to Crofton recently, Mr. Speaker. This is a great example what value add can look like. Crofton Mill lost over 100 workers, Mr. Speaker, but our side of the House, we worked with that private sector company to ensure that they transition to value add. they're now creating restaurant supplies that replace single-use plastics, Mr. Speaker. And I will tell the member on the other side of the House that every single one of those 100 employees are back working, Mr. Speaker.